Hi, so I'm going to be speaking about adoption of Layer 2, specifically in what we're now in, which is a multi-chain world. And I think it's very tempting when we're all building roll-ups and Layer 2 solutions to focus very much on the technological solutions. And there are lots of really important problems to be solving, and we're all very excited about those. But in the meantime, things are really changing out in the rest of the cryptocurrency ecosystem, and it's not waiting for some of these solutions. And I think it's quite high stakes at the moment that we maybe think about some of the challenges for adoption of Layer 2 alongside that in order to also prioritize the order some of these solutions, some of these problems are worked on, particularly seeing, for example, what's happened in Bitcoin, where, of course, there is Layer 2. Lightning exists. You can use it. But I would argue potentially it's become irrelevant in the period that it took to build and launch. And the same could happen to Ethereum Layer 2 if we don't approach it in a certain way. So just quickly, who am I? I come from the UK, studied at Cambridge Engineering, went to work at IBM. And then since 2017, I've been working in this space, first of all at Bitfinex and Tether. I worked, for example, on launching Tether ERC20 on Ethereum, for better or worse, and then launched Bitfinex, which was an early decentralized exchange on Ethereum using 0x with an order book back in 2018. And so pretty much since that point, around 2019, have been working on Diversify. Diversify is a Layer 2. It's powered by Starkware, so it's a standalone roll-up specifically for DeFi, so you can trade, swap, invest at very low cost. We're using Stark proofs that get submitted onto mainnet Ethereum, and it's been running for almost 2 years now in production on mainnet, which is pretty cool. We've had days where with the throughput, we've got down to a very low cost of only kind of a few cents per transaction, which is thanks to the fact that it's application specific rather than EVM. And so in this presentation, I'll talk a bit about the state of where Layer 2 adoption is now, some strategies potentially that we can consider for how Layer 2 is going to fit into the rest of the multi-chain, and then talk a bit about bridges and how I think that can help with what everyone's building. So in the beginning, there was Ethereum, and we all loved Ethereum because you could deploy smart contracts. There was composability between these different contracts, and we could build DeFi, which everyone got excited about and caused kind of the real first rush of adoption. And everyone was very happy about that. But as there was more and more adoption, gas fees rose due to usage, and these higher fees made Ethereum less usable for a lot of developers and a lot of users. We got slow block times, slow inclusion of transactions into blocks, and this was frustrating. And so everyone came up with this idea of Layer 2, and it was simple. We'd build these Layer 2 solutions, whether they were EVM compatible or not, whether they were optimistic or zero knowledge, didn't really matter. We'd get them built, and then all the users, all the applications would migrate across up to Layer 2, and that would be amazing, and we'd all be happy again. This is what many of us have been building for the last few years. But in the meantime, the kind of rest of the world hasn't waited for Ethereum to scale and for these Layer 2 solutions to come about. And the picture is now much more complicated. So yes, there are live roll-ups of all different descriptions that exist, and you can go and use them. But also, we've got EVM-compatible chains like Polygon, Binance Smart Chain, Avalanche, which all may have solved some of the problems that were faced to provide lower transaction fees for users and developers in different ways, different consensus mechanisms, whatever they are. And we've also got non-EVM chains, Terra, the Cosmos ecosystem, Polkadot, solving, again, the same challenges in different ways. 50-plus bridges, different sort of side chains, parachains, whatever you want to call them, that are all interoperating with users spread across them. And this makes the picture much more complicated, and it makes it much harder to see where Layer 2 sort of fits into all of this. So we can ask ourselves the question of how do we actually want this to look? I mean, what's the role that Ethereum's going to play in kind of this wider network, and what's the role that Layer 2 can play? So it is clear that developers and users have a choice. It's not just Layer 1 and Layer 2. And we can't just dismiss everything that's going on outside of Ethereum. yes, some of these EVM chains might just be simple forks with kind of centralized validator sets, but others have made lots of innovations, and there is real DeFi activity, user activity going on. Kind of TVL, which isn't a great metric, but is a metric of layer 2s is just over 6 billion. Most of that's on Arbitrum, but there's sort of a range. But in comparison, the kind of growth of these other chains has been much bigger in the same time period, reaching kind of 56 billion deposited and kind of growing faster at the moment. And user number, kind of addresses created, also not kind of a perfect metric for users, also much higher on kind of alternative layer 1s compared to sort of EVM layer 2s and other sort of layer 2 or rollups. So we can see it's not gaining so far the kind of adoption we'd like. It still is on the fringe for most people. I think if you speak to a lot of kind of users of DeFi on other chains, they may be aware of layer 2, maybe excited that there might be a token of some sort in the future. But beyond that, I think this kind of narrative of it's going to be more secure, better technology isn't really sort of connecting through to most to people outside yet. And there's a few kind of reasons for that. I mean, this is, I think, by the way, not necessarily like the true comparison of alternative layer 1s to Ethereum layer 2, but this is, I think, the perception. So it's easier, maybe more fun to build on some of these other chains compared to it being hard and frustrating on layer 2s. Transaction cost is actually lower still than most sort of rollups. Finality is kind of a big issue in that proofs, whether it's for zero knowledge or optimistic sort of fraud proofs, take a long time, and that makes bridges very difficult. And the economic security kind of being the kind of major sort of clear advantage of Ethereum, actually, we've heard multiple times today, isn't necessarily a complete picture of reality at the moment, especially while the kind of training wheels are on with most rollups. And on top of that, there's just a whole cognitive barrier of trying to explain what a layer 2 is, how it relates to Ethereum, how it relates to everything else, which is kind of partly, these are the reasons I think why we've seen this so far. So with that context, what strategies could like layer 2 take to fit into this new world? And so this is where we are now. Like if we were to reposition this, one option would be go head to head, use the same strategies that other chains that have launched have been using. So the classic layer 1 DeFi playbook, which we've seen played out multiple times, particularly with EVM forks, has been build an EVM, make sure it's got low fees. It doesn't really matter how you do it. If you can do it with a ZK EVM, that's the best, maybe. If you have to do it with some sort of centralized consensus, fine for the short term. Maybe try and improve it later. Create a token and launch it. And make sure that loads of the tokens are used to incentivize people to come and deposit, put all their funds on. And TVL will grow. You've got a narrative going, maybe lots of users to start with. Everyone forks everything and puts it on. If they've got time to add a new name and sort of UI, even better than just forking it. And hopefully that gets everything going. And I think this is to be honest, from most people I've spoken to, what I think a lot of people expect maybe ZK Sync, Optimism, and Arbitrum to do at some point as their way of combating and kind of attracting users over. But it's unclear how much that will cost, whether it will be sustainable. And it kind of seems a bit disappointing, right? If we've put all this energy into building these amazing roll-up solutions and solving incredibly hard technical solutions, shouldn't we have shouldn't we get more benefit of that rather than just using the same playbook that other EVM sort of forks or chains have used to try and attract users over? But we probably would see kind of this area of the layer 2s grow. It's maybe still wouldn't be so integrated with everything else that's going on, but maybe we could win across lots of users and get sort of the ecosystem kick-started. But of course, like this isn't going to be happening in isolation. So chains like Avalanche putting huge amounts of money behind their tokens, behind incentives to attract developers. And so this would be, it would need kind of these numbers of 200 million, $500 million behind these incentive programs to really make a dent and to sort of go on that head-to-head route of just positioning layer 2 as kind of another alternative. So another potential strategy, kind of more inspired by what's happening potentially in the Cosmos ecosystem, for example, right now, is to become more of a hub in an ecosystem of application-specific chains. So one of the sort of advantages of rollups is that although you can replicate what's happening on Ethereum and create another EVM chain, you can also create differentiated applications. You can connect them potentially, and that's a harder question, which I think we'll come on to, and then sort of build a ecosystem that can fit into the wider ecosystem and play maybe a special role in it. This is starting to happen. Sort of, you could imagine it happening from what's out there. So there are already some EVM rollups. There are some application-specific ones like Immutable for NFTs or DYDX for derivatives, Diversify for swapping your tokens and earning yield. But there isn't yet kind of a clear communication protocol. There aren't really bridges between most of these. They're all operating in isolation, unlike sort of, I think, many of the chains that have focused on interoperability and bridges outside of Ethereum Layer 2. But you can see here kind of example of what this looks like in Cosmos. You have a whole bunch of different chains that are connected together: Terra, Cosmos, Osmosis. They each solve kind of the different problems and are optimized for that, and therefore get the maximum benefit out of what they've built, but with a really close protocol for communication. In Cosmos, this is called IBC, and it's a native protocol implemented at like kind of the SDK level, so that each chain has the same interface and can bridge assets across and information across without needing sort of secondary sort of lower class bridges built on top to do that. And that gives them a big advantage because you end up actually not with each single chain trying to compete for itself, but the full sort of suite of tools and benefits. So if we kind of imagined this for what it would look like on Ethereum Layer 2, we'd have sort of a network around Ethereum of these different rollups. These could be all different sort of implementations. There's obviously so many that are being built, but with a shared protocol communication layer that allowed these to act as kind of one unified sort of interface for Ethereum rather than being separate ecosystems. And then to connect and bridge these to the wider ecosystem, sort of benefiting from the fact that Ethereum still, and for the foreseeable next few years, is going to remain, in any case, the place where a lot of activity is and where many people want to be able to inherit some security and some assets. And so how could we get to that sort of scenario? So there are some inherent advantages that rollups have for bridging and that Ethereum has to get us towards that world. One is that Ethereum is still the layer one with by far the highest sort of TVL of assets, the most interesting assets that many people want on their chains, on their rollups, on their EVMs. It has the highest liquidity by far of any chain and highest economic security. Secondly, sort of layer twos have this privileged bridge to Ethereum and I think kind of designed around this idea of being a bridge essentially where you can prove your state and therefore inherit some security from Ethereum and also know that the assets can always exit back there. But because of this, layer twos are also so for example, a zero knowledge rollup is designed to be able to prove its state at any time to Ethereum, but in theory could also prove their state to other chains. And so that is an advantage and something that's needed for any state proof type bridge, and can give the ability, in theory, if we solve some challenges, to bridge more securely to any chain outside of Ethereum and outside of layer 2 as well. So kind of current state of where bridges are in layer 2 now is not great. So I think for most rollups, they have a really, really good bridge to Ethereum because that's part of the sort of inherent design. But most rollups don't have much else. If you look at Diversify, there is a Polygon and Arbitrum bridge and kind of a half bridge to Terra only for Anchor UST. Arbitrum has kind of a wider range for most EVM chains, but little outside that, and actually liquidity on a lot of these is low. And I think I won't go through every rollup, but basically it's very weak if you compare to something like Polygon or Avalanche, or actually sort of many outside the ecosystem. And the types of bridges are also partially or fully centralized, mostly sort of multi-sig relayers with sort of X of a certain number who have to sign in order to relay across, maybe using AMMs with some collateral, but that leads to quite high fees and sort of low incentives for people to provide liquidity for these bridges. And the kind of challenge really for state-proof bridges and all bridges at the moment is this kind of slow finality, which is inherent in layer 2 rollups. So whether it's CK or optimistic, we've got to wait for either some sort of proof or like a fraud-proof time period before you can be certain that your assets are going to be able to be received on whichever chain or received by the person you sent them to. And this makes it much harder to bridge across. So what sort of alternative approaches are there and what's being looked at the moment? So the first, and I think kind of the dream scenario really would be a shared protocol that would be implemented by all rollups, maybe inherited at the kind of genesis state, part of the application, and with a standard format where you have a light client on every rollup that can verify state proofs from other rollups. This would be very similar then to IBC and Cosmos and allow you to sort of move funds across and have a real interoperability between these, where you can in theory have funds on Optimism and make a swap on Arbitrum without needing to yourself bridge across. It can be handled at almost a protocol layer with routing. And this would be the kind of ideal user experience, but you could then extend this to other chains outside of Ethereum as well. To get there, you probably need some form of pre-commitment prior to the kind of final state being committed to Ethereum in order to have a much shorter finality. And there's been a few discussions at this event of ways of achieving that. One, for example, would be having multiple sequencers who might sort of pre-sign or have to have some stake that they put down in order to commit that they will include a certain transaction, even if it isn't necessarily included or kind of completely final until a later point when some zero knowledge proof is submitted to Ethereum. There's other approaches that are spoken about, like mass migrations. So again, this kind of would involve some sort of standards and shared format to translate between different elements of transactions on one rollup to another, and then have some sort of layer 1 transaction that combines them all together to allow a mass movement of funds between one rollup to another without the cost of every single person having to withdraw to Ethereum and back into another chain. And also then this idea of building state-proof bridges with light clients implemented as part of rollups that could verify their state on other bridges. And so these are kind of all share a lot of elements. There's probably some subset or combination of all of these which could allow us to have much better bridges to rollups than are possible on regular non-rollup chains. And this is kind of the opportunity, I think, for this ecosystem, which is that if we can create a really strong solution for that, we can really make layer 2 become a kind of secure hub for cross-chain DeFi, whether that's inside or outside of Ethereum. Diversify, for example, has been experimenting with adding bridges to EVM and non-EVM chains. These aren't kind of the goal in terms of like the technology being used because of mainly of this finality challenge at the moment. But for example, we've added a small bridge to Terra where you have Anchor Protocol and UST. It's already accounting for like kind of more than 30 million after just 2 months of the assets held in Diversify and growing very fast. And similarly, we have a kind of, let's say, like second-class bridge to Polygon, which again is now accounting for more of the kind of users and onboarding of funds than the one from Ethereum, mainly because there's a lot of sort of smaller users who are active there who can afford then to get onto a rollup instead of having to come via Ethereum. So what I kind of want to kind of put in people's minds is this is kind of the big challenge that I think that collectively builders should be thinking about. I think it should be used to kind of maybe prioritize the way that we are building rollups and launching them. And if you are yourself working on anything or thinking about this challenge of layer 2 bridge protocols or connecting rollups together, please do speak to us. We really want to be implementing these for users and giving a chance like to have very early feedback from sort of the users who are on Diversify now. And we're thinking very heavily about these problems and would like to talk to you. So yeah, thank you very much. I think the opportunity here is to make layer 2 really the heart of the cross-chain rather than kind of a fringe, fringe obsession. And that can lead to really effortless DeFi that's kind of the next level beyond Ethereum. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Come on, don't be shy. Okay. Oh.
Do you think so? Not having composability in a sense is can add like more security to your application. So do you think composability is like, do some of your users actually ask for it, or is it good for you that you're kind of a silo and users come there, they trade between themselves and they leave when they want?
I think composability on a big scale is definitely a disadvantage, mainly because it can lead to fewer applications. I think in the kind of building phase, and for example, EVM with full composability, it's usually advantageous for creating new applications, experimenting, but it is possible then to implement certain things that we know like users of DeFi or Web3 are going to want to do in much more efficient ways without composability. And that's where I think kind of this duality of, let's say, like flexible EVM chains where you can experiment versus later like specific rollups that are implemented just for certain applications can really play well together as long as they're able to sort of move funds easily between them. In the case of Diversify, I mean, it's optimized for things that we already know today people want to do, but it may not be what people want to do in a few years. So swapping tokens, earning yield, maybe transferring tokens, like those are the three things that we already know people want to do. And so we could really optimize for the absolute best user experience and lowest sort of cost on a roll up for those. But that will have to evolve over time. And therefore you need kind of some composability to learn what people want to do.
Are you scared of flash loans is kind of my questions. if that comes about and then you can have funds coming from everywhere and, attacks.
I think yes, but then also that there's benefits to that as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question?
How do you see the role of standards in the evolution of layer 2? Is it too soon to be talking about formal standards for interoperability and things like that, or do we need to be having more discussions, and will that catalyze layer 2 growth?
Yeah, I absolutely think that standards for interoperability is what we should be talking about right now. I think that's the highest priority personally. That's kind of what I was trying to say. I mean, I don't think it is being spoken about enough, and I think a lot of personally, my impression is a lot of sort of builders are focused on different challenges at the moment, but that's going to impact adoption. And I don't know how we get it into the narrative more. I don't know who exactly should be sort of leading on those standards, but yeah, I think it's a big problem.
Anyway.
Which do you think is more important, standards for L2 within Ethereum or standards for L2 communication with other layer 1s?
I would say starting off with communication between different rollups layer 2 in Ethereum, and if we have a really useful and shared standard for that, I think then it would be other chains are going to want to bridge and connect to it. Right now, because we don't have that, it's almost not worth, I think, connecting to each individual rollup or layer 2 because on their own, most aren't able to offer something different than what already exists in the rest of, let's say, like multi-chain crypto.
So that should be that first step then, L2 standardization for communication should be easy enough. I mean, there's only like 10 or 12 groups, but they're all in the Ethereum community. So they know how to contact each other. Somebody's got to start.
Yeah, I mean, standards I think are never easy, but sort of, yeah, in practice we know who needs to be talking about it. But the problems each rollup needs to solve are maybe slightly different and, fits into the rest of their priorities. So,
yeah, thanks. it's not that easy to change because it's in smart contract. so if we change how to do the standards and protocols, then we have to change to smart contract and to do the upgrade the network. So there are a lot of work we have to do. But absolutely, we should talk. My question is, are you worried about the security concerns if you have too many hubs? Each time we do a hop between one chain to another chain, you kind of inherit the security assumptions of both. Once you do another hop, after that, then you're inheriting the 3 security assumptions, and it's compounding. Even like within on-chain, it's compounding. Are you worried about that security, I would say, concerns, I would say, or increased level of security, I would say, exposure to any assumptions with this multi-chain ecosystem that we're envisioning?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's why, so, you know, personally, I think it's kind of like water flowing downhill. We will always have a drive for, and I think it's now been, personally, I believe it's been evidenced over the last 2 years that there will be a drive for multiple chains with multiple different ecosystems, and therefore we'll need some sort of multi-hop, and therefore what we should push for is an interoperability standard that's at the lowest level possible, rather than like bridges at a very high level that are all different with all different security concerns, and to at least minimize that risk, even if we can't get rid of it.
Anyone else?
Read this discussion about standardization of L2s. Aren't we a bit screwed because literally all of the L2s are essentially incentivized to attract TVL, right? So that means incentives-wise, they're essentially always going to be in opposition to each other. How would one like resolve this, right? Because it starts to feel like a zero-sum kind of world where if I'm an L2 provider, I am incentivized to ensure that everybody uses my L2 and not everybody else, right? And similarly with bridges, right? If I'm using Diversify today, I'm not using Socket or whatever. Is the world really that like zero sum, or is there some way to break like this incentive mechanism we might be trapped in?
I think that's a very big question, but I'd say, well, I mean, what's more likely in 2 years' time? Are there going to be 50 like very similar EVM chains, each with different TVL, or are we going to see eventually a commoditization, let's say, of like roll-up technology, where over time we see the best standards emerge, the most usable one emerge, and then a kind of narrowing down. I think in most technology spheres we've seen obviously like lots of experimentation, but then an eventual sort of coming to a point of a smaller number. So to some extent, yes, in the short term, everyone's going to want to compete and attract TVL and maybe not have this interoperability, but that's going to lead to, personally, I think, like, for example, it could lead to just Ethereum layer 2 losing out to some other ecosystem that solves this without roll-ups, but solves it with some consensus layer and, you know, subnets or whatever. So there are other stakeholders, maybe big ETH holders, you know, the Ethereum Foundation, many others who are more neutral and can maybe help guide, but otherwise it's going to, I think it's a good question which has no like obvious answer.
I guess L2Bit shouldn't focus on tracking the TVL then, maybe. Anyway, we're done with questions for now. Thank you guys, and you're all invited for the lunch that's happening now.